The gavel had not even dropped when my father adjusted his $3,000 tie and whispered that I had 48 hours to vacate my house. He flashed a calculated smirk, meant to break me before the gallery. He did not realize the judge was not looking at the forged documents. The judge was staring at the jagged scar on my collarbone. In under 10 minutes, my father's trap would bury him instead. Hello and welcome to Maya Revenge Stories. Our channel has recently had its monetization disabled by YouTube, leaving us without the necessary budget to continue our operations. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us with just $1 to help us pay our dedicated staff so they can afford their living expenses and keep creating these stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link provided in the video description or the pinned comments. My name is Jasmine Sandoval, and this is the moment my life fractured and reshaped itself. The air inside the Central District Court of Portland, Oregon, was heavy, chilled by an aggressive air conditioning system that seemed to freeze the very oxygen in my lungs. The courtroom was a sprawling cavern of dark mahogany and polished brass, a place meticulously designed to make ordinary people feel insignificant. We were gathered there to settle the massive estate of my late grandmother, Beatrice. It was a staggering fortune that spanned decades, built on prime commercial real estate and quiet, lucrative investments. To me, it was the legacy of a woman who had shown me kindness. To my father, it was simply an empire that he believed belonged solely to his bloodline, a prize to be hoarded. Sitting across the wide central aisle from me was Richard Vance, an infamous real estate tycoon who also happened to be the man who gave me life. He sat with his legs casually crossed, exuding an aura of absolute, untouchable arrogance. His custom-tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than I earned in 12 months of grueling labor. He was flanked by a team of high-priced corporate attorneys who buzzed around him like obedient worker bees. They were constantly shuffling thick stacks of legal documents, whispering cutthroat strategies into his ear, and casting disdainful glances in my direction. I sat completely alone on the hard, unyielding wooden bench opposite them. I had no lawyer. I had no legal team to object on my behalf. I had only the faded denim jacket on my back, my tightly clasped hands, and a quiet resolve anchoring me to my seat. Richard was not just there to claim his mother's millions. He was there to ensure my utter, humiliating ruin. Through a labyrinth of vicious legal motions, he had intentionally petitioned the court to strip me of the ownership of the small, modest house I had been living in. The property was technically still in my grandmother's name, a lingering administrative detail he had seized upon with predatory glee. His goal was not just to take the physical property. His goal was to throw me out onto the cold, unforgiving pavement, to erase me from the family ledger entirely, and to watch me suffer. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet as we waited for the proceedings to officially commence. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mocking ticking of the antique clock mounted high on the back wall, in that heavy, oppressive stillness. Richard leaned across the aisle toward me. The cloying, heavy scent of his expensive cologne hit me before his venomous words did. He leaned in close, his eyes completely dead and devoid of any paternal warmth, and delivered his strike with surgical precision. "I hope you like living on the streets, because I made sure you do not get a single penny." He waited for the tears to fall. He waited for the panic to set in, for the pathetic begging, for the public breakdown that would validate his ultimate control over my fate. He desperately wanted to see me shatter into a million jagged pieces right there on the polished courtroom floor, a spectacle for his expensive legal team to enjoy. Instead, I gave him nothing of the sort. A dry, hollow smirk tugged at the corner of my mouth, followed by a quiet, harsh laugh that scraped against the back of my throat. It was a purely involuntary reaction, born from years of watching this exact man use his immense wealth to manipulate, suffocate, and destroy anyone who did not bend completely to his iron will. The sheer, pathetic predictability of his cruelty was almost comical to me now. That singular, bitter sound of my laughter cut through the hushed, cavernous courtroom like a sudden gunshot. Behind the elevated, imposing oak bench, Judge Arthur Sterling physically paused. He had been aggressively flipping through a towering stack of legal files. His demeanor entirely detached, bureaucratic, and exhausted by the morning's docket. At the sharp sound of my laugh, his hands stopped moving entirely. He slowly raised his head from the forged estate documents that Richard's team had so carefully prepared. The judge lowered his reading glasses down the bridge of his nose, his thick brow furrowing in deep, unmistakable annoyance at the sudden disruption. He looked directly at me, his jaw set, clearly ready to issue a stern, booming reprimand for breaking the sacred decorum of his court. But as his sharp, discerning eyes locked onto my face, the angry scowl on his lips completely froze. The irritation practically drained from his aged features, rapidly replaced by a sudden, intense, and searching scrutiny. He leaned forward over the heavy wooden bench, squinting hard as if trying to place a ghost standing right in the middle of the waking world. His unwavering gaze drifted downward from my eyes, lingering specifically on the exposed skin just above the collar of my shirt. I sat there, suddenly breathless and pinned by his stare. I watched, entirely captivated, as the judge's expression slowly, miraculously transformed from judicial annoyance into a look of absolute earth-shattering astonishment. Growing up in the Vance household meant living under the crushing weight of a singular, obsessive religion, and that religion was real estate. For my father, acquiring land, leveling neighborhoods, and erecting glass towers was not merely a profession, it was the very measure of a human being's worth. He demanded that his empire become the sole focus of his children, a legacy we were expected to worship and expand with the exact same ruthless hunger he possessed. There was absolutely no room for deviation, no space for individual dreams. You either pledged your unwavering loyalty to the company, or you ceased to exist in his eyes. My older brother, Preston, understood this transactional love perfectly. He folded himself effortlessly into the mold our father had meticulously crafted for him. Preston became the undisputed golden boy of the family, memorizing complex zoning laws by the time he was 15 years old and analyzing corporate profit margins before he could even legally buy a drink. In return for his utter obedience, he was showered with the extravagant spoils of the empire. At 24 years old, he was handed a prestigious vice president title, a sprawling corner office overlooking the city skyline, and the keys to a $200,000 imported sports car. Preston wore the corporate leash willingly, mistaking his gilded cage for freedom, and mistaking our father's conditional financial investments for actual paternal affection. I, however, found the atmosphere of those executive boardrooms utterly suffocating. The air always felt recycled, sterile, and heavy with unspoken deceit. I could not bring myself to care about maximizing quarterly earnings or the ruthless displacement of lower-income families just to build another block of luxury condominiums. Instead of reviewing contract clauses, I was drawn to the visceral, chaotic reality of the outside world. I wanted a life that held tangible meaning, a life measured not by the accumulation of vast wealth, but by the preservation of human life in its most raw, vulnerable form. That relentless pursuit led me away from the family dynasty and straight into the grueling, demanding ranks of Apex Corps Response. We were a specialized, high-risk disaster rescue agency, rapidly deployed to the most unstable and hazardous environments imaginable. We deliberately ran toward the violent catastrophes that everyone else was desperately fleeing. To me, it was a profound and necessary calling. To my father, it was an unforgivable, public betrayal. When I firmly rejected the plush executive position he had set aside for me, choosing instead to risk my life in mudslides and collapsed structures for a modest salary, his reaction was not explosive anger. He did not yell, and he certainly never laid a hand on me. Physical abuse was entirely beneath a man of his calculated, refined stature. His weapon of choice was far more insidious. It was absolute, chilling erasure. He simply stopped acknowledging my existence. In the Vance family, silence was the ultimate punishment. I was systematically uninvited from the lavish holiday galas. My name was permanently scrubbed from casual family conversations. If I happened to walk into the grand foyer of his sprawling estate, his eyes would slide right past me, gazing at the empty space as if he were looking at a mildly annoying shadow on the expensive wallpaper. There were countless long evenings where I sat completely alone in my small apartment, painfully aware of the massive, catered feasts happening miles away, feasts where my chair had been permanently removed from the long dining table. I will not pretend that his calculated coldness did not hollow me out. For a very long time, that silent rejection carved a deep, aching void inside my chest. Every child harbors a primal desire to be seen and valued by their parents, and being treated as a literal ghost by the man whose blood ran in my veins was a quiet, enduring agony. I spent thousands of hours wondering if I was fundamentally broken, if choosing my own conscience over his wealth was truly a fatal flaw in my character. But that agonizing void did not destroy me. Instead, the relentless, brutal reality of my work at Apex Core slowly began to fill it. When you spend your days pulling crushed bodies from the mangled wreckage of a highway pileup, or when you hold the trembling hand of a trapped stranger while the earth threatens to swallow you both, the petty grievances of a corporate tyrant rapidly lose their power. I learned the true, terrifying fragility of human life. I saw what real courage looked like, and it looked nothing like a man sitting safely behind a polished mahogany desk, ruining lives with the simple stroke of a fountain pen. Facing death on a regular basis forged a new, unbreakable kind of armor around my soul. The searing heat of disaster zones burned away my lingering desperation for his approval. I realized that the millions of dollars he wielded like a weapon were entirely meaningless in the face of nature's fury. The heavy steel cables and hydraulic rescue tools I carried every day held infinitely more genuine value than his entire stock portfolio. By the time I sat across from him in that courtroom, I was no longer the wounded daughter desperate for a single glance of recognition. I was a survivor, hardened by fire and earth, completely immune to the hollow threats of a man who knew the high price of everything but the true value of absolutely nothing. The memory of the Oakhaven Ridge collapse always tasted like copper and wet earth in my mouth. It happened exactly 5 years ago, for 3 solid weeks, relentless. Torrential rain had battered the Pacific Northwest, saturating the steep slopes until the soil simply liquefied. When the mountain finally gave way, it did not happen with a warning. A massive wall of mud, boulders, and ancient Douglas firs cascaded down the ridge, completely swallowing a remote geological research station in a matter of seconds. My Apex Core response unit was the first on the scene. We were inserted by a military surplus transport helicopter, dropping into a nightmare landscape that was still actively shifting. The roar of the twin rotors above us was deafening, but it could not drown out the terrifying groans of the unstable earth beneath our boots. The entire area was a treacherous death trap of slick mud, aggressively snapping timber, and violently surging floodwaters. The ground was literally moving like a dark, angry ocean. We fanned out over the debris field. The structural skeleton of the research station had been crushed like an empty soda can. I was navigating a precarious pile of shattered concrete when I heard a faint, desperate sound. It was barely a whisper, slipping through the violent howling of the wind. I dropped to my knees, clawing away heavy chunks of plaster with my bare hands until I found a narrow void in the wreckage. Trapped deep inside that suffocating pocket of darkness was a young scientist named Leo. He was covered in thick gray slurry, coughing up dust with every shallow breath. A massive, twisted steel support beam had collapsed directly across his lower legs, pinning him securely against the fractured concrete floor. Worse still, the ground directly beneath him was visibly buckling. A deep fissure was slowly tearing open right beside his head, threatening to swallow him completely into the mountain's belly. I keyed my shoulder microphone to call for heavy extraction tools, but the radio immediately flared to life with an aggressive transmission from our command center. Seismic sensors had just detected a massive structural failure further up the mountain. A secondary landslide was imminent. It was expected to be twice as large as the first. The order was broadcast loud and clear to every rescue worker on the grid. All units, execute immediate emergency evacuation. I repeat, abandon the hot zone immediately. We have less than 3 minutes before total sector collapse. My teammates started falling back to the designated extraction point, shouting my name over the raging storm. I looked down at the trapped young man. His eyes were wide, filled with the absolute, freezing terror of someone who knew he was about to die in the dark. "I am not leaving him," I stated into my radio, immediately cutting the connection before command could order me again. There was no time for backup. There was no time for caution. I unclipped my personal mechanical winch from my harness and dragged my heavy hydraulic spreader tool toward the collapsing crevice. I forced my body through a jagged gap in the twisted metal, ignoring the sharp edges tearing through my protective uniform. The space was incredibly claustrophobic, reeking of ruptured gas lines and fresh blood. I wedged the steel jaws of the hydraulic spreader under the massive beam crushing Leo. I pumped the handle frantically, forcing the tool to fight against tons of dead weight. The metal shrieked and popped in protest, but the beam slowly began to lift. Inch by agonizing inch, the pressure released. "Pull your legs out right now," I screamed over the deafening noise. He dragged himself backward, sobbing from the sudden rush of agony. But just as his boots cleared the steel trap, the mountain roared. The secondary landslide hit the ruins above us with the force of a runaway freight train. The entire world violently shook. Above us, the compromised ceiling of the research station finally gave way. A massive section of concrete and jagged rebar plummeted directly toward Leo. Instinct took over completely. I threw my body forward, aggressively shoving him flat against the floor, and arched my back over his trembling frame to form a human shield. The impact was absolutely explosive. A jagged, rusted spike of rebar tore violently through my thick protective jacket, slicing deep into my left collarbone. The pain was blinding. A brilliant flash of white-hot agony that entirely short-circuited my brain. The sheer weight of the debris pinned us in absolute darkness. I choked on the thick dust, my own blood soaking the collar of my shirt, but I kept my body rigid over the young man. I held the line. We stayed buried alive in that suffocating tomb for 6 agonizing hours before the secondary rescue crews finally dug us out. Months later, long after the physical wounds had closed, a small, unmarked envelope arrived at my modest apartment. Inside was a handwritten letter, penned on heavy, expensive stationery. The author chose to remain completely anonymous, identifying himself only as Leo's father. The ink was slightly smudged, revealing the profound emotion of the writer. He expressed an overwhelming, bottomless gratitude. He wrote that my refusal to retreat had handed him his entire world back, and that he would spend the rest of his life indebted to the stranger who bled to save his only son. I folded that letter carefully and locked it away in a small wooden box under my bed. I never breathed a single word about it to Richard or Preston. I knew exactly what they would say. They would call me a fool. They would aggressively mock the permanent, jagged scar on my collarbone as the pathetic result of a useless, dangerous job that yielded zero financial profit. They could never comprehend that pulling another human being from the jaws of death was a wealth they could never possess. The harsh, fluorescent lighting of the courtroom abruptly pulled me back to the present moment, dragging me away from the suffocating memory of the mudslide. Richard's lead attorney was still droning on at the podium, aggressively waving a thick stack of printed motions. He was tossing around sterile legal terms like asset liquidation, fiduciary obligations, and property reallocations, systematically attempting to reduce my entire existence to a mere administrative error that needed to be erased. But I was no longer paying any attention to the lawyer. My eyes were completely locked on the man sitting high above us. Judge Arthur Sterling had stopped reading. He had stopped moving entirely. His piercing gaze remained fiercely pinned to the exposed skin of my collarbone, right where the jagged, white tissue of the scar peeked out from beneath my collar. The atmosphere in the massive room began to shift, growing incredibly thick and pressurized. without warning. Judge Sterling raised a single, flat hand in the air. The gesture was so sudden and commanding that Richard's high-priced lawyer immediately choked on his own words, snapping his mouth shut in utter confusion. The heavy silence that followed was absolute, ringing in my ears like a physical force. Judge Sterling slowly reached up with trembling fingers and removed his reading glasses, placing them carefully onto the polished oak surface of his desk. He completely ignored the confused, wealthy men sitting on the right side of the aisle. "Ms. Sandoval," the judge said, his voice completely devoid of its previous bureaucratic boom. It was a soft, strained sound, rough around the edges, as if he were fighting a sudden lack of oxygen. "I need you to stand up, please." I pushed myself up from the hard wooden bench. My legs felt strangely numb. I stood perfectly straight, squaring my shoulders, bracing myself for whatever procedural blow was about to come. Judge Sterling leaned heavily over the bench, gripping the wooden edge so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. His chest hitched as he drew in a deep, uneven breath. "Ms. Sandoval, I have to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it for the official court record. Were you the emergency rescue worker designated as Unit Number 407 during the Oak Haven Ridge collapse exactly 5 years ago?" The entire courtroom froze. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. I felt the blood completely drain from my face. My mind raced, desperately trying to connect the dots. I thought of the young scientist buried in the dark. I thought of the anonymous letter safely locked in a wooden box under my bed. The author had only called himself Leo's father. I looked into the aging, desperate eyes of the honorable man sitting above me, and the final puzzle piece forcefully clicked into place. "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice remarkably steady despite the hurricane spinning inside my chest. A profound, earth-shattering gasp escaped the judge's lips. The stoic, impenetrable facade of the veteran magistrate instantly crumbled into a million pieces. The deep lines on his face softened, and hot, unashamed tears suddenly welled up in his eyes, spilling over his lower lashes and tracking down his weathered cheeks. He did not bother to wipe them away. He looked out at the gallery, his voice thick with raw, overwhelming emotion. "5 years ago," Judge Sterling announced to the dead-silent room, his voice shaking violently, "a massive mudslide nearly took my only son from me. He was trapped under thousands of pounds of concrete. Every single emergency agency ordered a full tactical retreat because the mountain was coming down a second time. Everyone fell back. But one rescue worker deliberately defied a direct order, crawled into the collapsing wreckage, and used her own body to shield my boy from the falling debris." He paused, swallowing hard, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. "That woman gave me my son's life back. She bled for a stranger, and she never once asked for a single shred of recognition." A collective murmur of shock rippled through the gallery, but the beautiful, heavy emotional weight of the moment was entirely lost on the man sitting across the aisle. Richard Vance aggressively shifted in his seat, his face twisting into a mask of deep, irritated impatience. He absolutely loathed any narrative where he was not the absolute center of attention. He stood up abruptly, roughly adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your Honor," Richard interrupted, his voice sharp and utterly void of empathy. "While this little human interest story is incredibly touching, it has absolutely no bearing on the legal division of my mother's estate. This is a court of law, not a charity gala. I respectfully demand that we return to the matter at hand and finalize the immediate transfer of the property she is currently squatting in. She has zero legal right to the house, and I want her out." The reaction was instantaneous. Judge Sterling grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block with a deafening, violent crack that echoed like a gunshot. The sound made Preston physically jump in his seat. "Sit down and close your mouth, Mr. Vance," Judge Sterling roared, the tears in his eyes instantly replaced by a raging, righteous inferno. He glared at Richard with a level of disgust so pure it seemed to lower the temperature of the room. "You have absolutely no idea who your daughter is. but I do. I know exactly what kind of blood runs in her veins, and I assure you, it is far too noble for the likes of you. And let me make one thing crystal clear to you, sir. I will absolutely not allow a verified hero to be stripped of her basic rights through shady, paper-pushing tactics in my courtroom. I watched, utterly fascinated, as the color rapidly drained from Preston's face. He shrank back into the wooden bench, looking suddenly very small and terrified. And for the very first time in my entire life, I saw the great Richard Vance physically falter. The smug, calculated arrogance melted off his face, replaced by a twitching, naked panic. He looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically, realizing in real time that his massive bank accounts, his expensive legal team, and his fake manufactured power held absolutely zero currency in this room anymore. The trap he had so meticulously set for me was rapidly turning its heavy steel jaws toward him. The explosive echo of the gavel was still ringing off the mahogany walls when the dynamic of the courtroom entirely inverted. Judge Sterling was no longer a grieving father expressing gratitude. He abruptly transformed back into a razor-sharp jurist who had just caught the scent of blood in the water. The revelation of my identity had fundamentally altered his perspective on the entire proceeding. If Richard Vance was willing to ruthlessly discard a daughter who routinely risked her life for strangers, what else was he willing to lie about? Judge Sterling sat back down heavily in his high leather chair. He reached for his reading glasses, sliding them deliberately back onto the bridge of his nose. He did not dismiss the court. He did not call for a recess. Instead, he pulled the massive, towering boxes of estate documents directly toward him. The atmosphere shifted from emotional shock to the suffocating tension of a ticking bomb. For 20 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the massive cavern of the courtroom was the crisp, methodical turning of thick parchment paper. Richard sat rigidly in his chair, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by a thin, glowing sheen of cold sweat forming on his forehead. "Counselor," Judge Sterling finally spoke, his voice entirely devoid of warmth, addressing Richard's lead attorney. "I am looking at the amended declarations of the Beatrice Vance Trust, specifically, the addendum drafted to completely disinherit Ms. Sandoval and seize her primary residence. This document was signed and notarized on the 14th of November, exactly 1 year ago." The attorney stood up nervously, smoothing his expensive silk tie. "Yes, Your Honor, that is correct. The matriarch wished to consolidate the holdings." Judge Sterling did not look up from the file. He flipped to a different, color-coded folder at the bottom of the stack. "That is utterly fascinating, because as a matter of standard protocol in contested estates of this magnitude, this court subpoenaed your mother's comprehensive medical records." The judge finally raised his eyes, and they were utterly lethal. According to the chief of neurology at Portland General Hospital, on the 14th of November, Beatrice Vance was on day 4 of a medically induced coma following her second major stroke. She was sustained by a ventilator and entirely unresponsive. So, I must ask you, Counselor, how exactly did a comatose woman manage to hold a pen, let alone possess the legal cognitive capacity to sign away a house? The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Richard's attorney turned completely pale, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, utterly unable to formulate a single word. He took a slow, deliberate step away from his own client, creating a visible physical distance between himself and the sinking ship. But the judge was not even close to being finished. He had pulled on a loose thread, and he was now aggressively unraveling Richard's entire fabricated universe. "This blatant forgery begs a much larger question," Judge Sterling continued, his voice echoing loudly across the room. "Why would a billionaire real estate magnate commit a major felony just to steal a modest, single-story residential property from his own estranged daughter? It lacks logical sense, unless, of course, the billionaire is not actually a billionaire anymore." I watched Richard grip the edge of the defendant's table so hard his knuckles turned purple. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter under the immense pressure. I have spent the last hour reviewing the corporate valuations submitted to this court, the judge said, pulling a thick financial ledger from the pile. Your primary holding company, Vance Global, is a hollow shell. You have over-leveraged every single commercial property in your portfolio. You are currently holding over $90 million in toxic, undisclosed debt. Your empire is exactly 30 days away from catastrophic insolvency. You did not want your mother's estate to honor her legacy. You desperately needed to liquidate her massive private trust fund to plug the gaping holes in your own failing business. The puzzle pieces locked together in my mind with breathtaking clarity. Richard was completely broke. The terrifying patriarch who had banished me for not contributing to his immense wealth was actually drowning in a sea of fraudulent loans. And this brings us to the most ironic twist of this entire sordid affair, Judge Sterling announced, a grim, humorless smile touching his lips. He looked directly at me for a brief moment before turning his crosshairs back to the men across the aisle. You see, Richard, in your desperate scramble to hide your impending bankruptcy from federal regulators, you quietly transferred the legal ownership of your primary commercial assets over to your newly appointed Chief Executive Officer. And who exactly is the Chief Executive Officer of Vance Global? Every single eye in the courtroom slowly turned to look at Preston. My older brother was sitting entirely frozen in his chair, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. You transferred all the holding companies to your son, the judge stated, hammering the final nail into the coffin. To shield yourself from personal liability, you made him the sole legal signatory. What you transferred to him was not a billion-dollar empire. You transferred him $90 million of fraudulent, unpayable debt. You intentionally positioned your own golden boy to take the inevitable fall when the federal indictments inevitably come down. Preston completely stopped breathing. The devastating reality hit him with the force of a physical blow. The prestigious title, the sprawling corner office, the expensive sports car. None of it was a reward for his unwavering loyalty. It was a carefully constructed trap. His father had systematically groomed him to be the ultimate sacrificial lamb. Preston turned slowly to look at the man he had worshipped his entire life. The utter betrayal in his eyes was staggering to witness. He realized, in front of a gallery of witnesses, that our father had never loved him. He had simply used him as a human shield against a federal prison sentence. Then, Judge Sterling delivered the final, crushing blow. Meanwhile, the judge said, tapping a single sheet of paper with his index finger, the small, $300,000 residential property that Ms. Sandoval currently resides in, the very house you just committed felony forgery to steal, happens to be the only asset in your mother's entire portfolio that is owned free and clear. It carries absolutely zero debt. It has no liens. It is completely clean. By trying to leave your daughter homeless, you inadvertently expose the fact that she is the only member of this family who possesses a single legitimate asset. Preston physically collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands, letting out a raw, guttural sob of absolute despair. The corporate heir, the favored son who had followed every single tyrannical rule, was completely destroyed. And there I sat, the outcast, the invisible daughter in the faded denim jacket, entirely untouched by the raging inferno that was currently burning their dynasty to the ground. The very choices that had supposedly ruined my life had ultimately become my absolute salvation. The courtroom remained dead silent, save for the pathetic weeping of the golden boy who had just realized his grand inheritance was nothing more than a pair of federal handcuffs. Judge Sterling did not merely dismiss the civil lawsuit. He absolutely incinerated it, with a final decisive strike of his heavy wooden gavel. He immediately suspended the probate proceedings. He issued an emergency judicial injunction right from the bench, instantly freezing every single bank account, property deed, and offshore shell corporation tied to the Vance family name. He then looked directly at the stunned court stenographer and explicitly ordered that the complete transcripts of the day, along with the forged medical addendum, be expedited directly to the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The petty civil dispute over my modest home had officially transformed into a massive federal criminal investigation into corporate fraud and forgery. The absolute destruction of a decades-old real estate empire did not take months or years. It took exactly 48 hours. Once the federal agents executed their search warrants and raided the corporate headquarters, the grand illusion of immense wealth vanished into thin air. Every single high-profile investor, political ally, and development partner severed their ties overnight, fleeing the toxic fallout like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The local news stations ran endless, humiliating loops of federal agents carrying dozens of heavy cardboard boxes full of seized evidence out of the sleek glass tower my father had built. Even more devastating was the immediate fracture within the family itself. My brother, Preston, who had been systematically set up to take the ultimate fall for the $90 million of hidden debt, quickly realized the perilous nature of his situation. In a desperate bid to reduce his own impending prison sentence, the Golden Boy entirely turned on his creator. He eagerly accepted a plea deal, turning state's evidence against our father and handing over every encrypted hard drive and secret ledger the federal prosecutors asked for. Preston had finally learned how to play the ruthless corporate survival game, and he used it to bury the exact man who had taught him the rules. 3 weeks after the courtroom explosion, I heard a quiet, hesitant knock on my front door. It was well past 9 o'clock in the evening, and a freezing, relentless Oregon rain was aggressively washing over the neighborhood. When I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, the man standing under the flickering yellow glow of my small porch light was entirely unrecognizable. Richard Vance was no longer wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit or a $3,000 silk tie. He wore a damp, heavily wrinkled trench coat. His shoulders stooped downward under the crushing weight of his total, catastrophic ruin. The arrogant, untouchable tycoon was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, desperate, aging man facing over 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He looked around at the modest, single-story home he had once tried to violently rip away from me. Then, he swallowed whatever tiny, pathetic fraction of pride he still possessed. "Jasmine," he whispered, his voice trembling violently against the freezing wind. "Please, I have absolutely nowhere else to go. My entire legal team abandoned me. The federal government seized the estate. Preston will not even answer my phone calls." He reached out a shaking, wet hand, though he did not dare step forward to touch me. "You saved that judge's son. He owes you his life. He deeply respects you. If you just go to his chambers, if you just speak to him on my behalf, maybe he can show some leniency. Maybe he can pull some strings. Please, you have to save your family." I stood perfectly still in the warm, inviting light of my doorway, looking out at the freezing man shivering in the dark. I searched my heart, but I felt absolutely no triumph. There was no soaring, vindictive joy in my chest, and there was no anger left to burn. "You do not have a family, Richard," I said, my voice completely calm and even. "You had a corporate balance sheet. You had profitable assets and disposable liabilities. You viewed your own loyal son as a convenient human shield, and you viewed me as a minor accounting error that you needed to aggressively erase." "I am your father," he pleaded, hot tears finally mixing with the cold rain streaming down his pale face. "No," I replied softly, looking directly into his hollow eyes. "You are just a man who let bottomless greed eat him alive until there was absolutely nothing human left inside. I do not hate you. I really do not. I just pity you, because even now, standing on the absolute edge of a prison cell, you still firmly believe that human lives are just currency you can trade to save your own skin. I cannot help you." I stepped back inside and gently closed the door, turning the heavy metal deadbolt with a solid, final click. I shut out the freezing storm, and I permanently shut out the bitter ghost of my past. The complex legal dust finally settled 7 months later, with the forged documents officially annulled by the state. The probate court systematically divided what little clean capital actually remained from my grandmother's original, legitimate trust. I received exactly 50% of that modest sum. It was nowhere near $1 billion, but it was honest, untainted money. I did not buy an expensive sports car, and I certainly did not invest in luxury condominiums. Instead, I purchased a sprawling, abandoned industrial warehouse on the rugged outskirts of Portland. I spent every single penny I received to completely renovate the space, transforming it into the Beatrice Vance Tactical Rescue Training Center. Today, we provide state-of-the-art disaster simulation, collapse structure navigation, and heavy extraction training for first responders traveling from all over the Pacific Northwest. I still actively deploy into the field with my Apex Corps response team, but now, when my grueling shift ends and the adrenaline finally fades, I do not return to a quiet, lonely apartment wondering why I am not loved or valued. I return to a massive, chaotic, and incredibly loud facility filled with brave men and women who willingly bleed for each other, who fiercely protect each other, and who truly understand the immeasurable, breathtaking value of a single human life. I finally built a real, lasting empire. It was not constructed out of cold glass and ruthless corporate contracts, but out of unwavering courage, shared sacrifice, and the only family I will ever need. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from. So please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's journey compelling, please consider helping our channel with a contribution of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous support directly pays the dedicated staff who work incredibly hard behind the scenes to bring you these stories, helping them feed their families and allowing them to continue creating great content for you. Thank you for your wonderful kindness, and please stay safe out there.